So hello and welcome to writing a social media policy for your library. My name is Shauna Kasegi. I use they or she pronouns and I work for the Southwest Wisconsin Library System. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box today. Laura and I will be keeping an eye on it. And yeah, so please don't hesitate to ask. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to our presenter, Laura Solomon.
Thanks, Shauna. Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you today from just south of Cleveland, Ohio, so not too far from Wisconsin. As Shauna mentioned, I do keep one eye on the chat and another one on the presentation, so to speak. So feel free to put your comments, questions, whatever you'd like, throw virtual tomatoes, whatever you'd like into the chat box. I do take a look at that every so often, and I actually prefer answering questions and responding to things in context, meaning that you're not interrupting me, and I'm pretty good at putting myself back on track. So let's go ahead and get started with this. I'm going to guess that if you are here today, that you probably don't have a social media for your library, or you're looking to revise the social media policy for your library. Please let me know in the chat which it is, or if you have some other variation of that scenario. I'm always interested to see kind of what the scope is of what we're looking at today. So are you creating one from scratch? Are you revising? Are you just kind of thinking about it? Like something you probably should do, but maybe you haven't done at your library. There's all kinds of iterations of that scenario. So go ahead, please put that into the chat. Meanwhile, come on, PowerPoint, you can do it. There we go. Okay, here's what we're going to be covering in the time that we have today. So we're going to talk about why you probably need a social media policy. Spoiler alert, yeah, you do. Or not, maybe if you're a very, very, very small library, like a one-person library, maybe not. But for virtually everyone else, you probably do. But we're going to talk about why that is. And of course, the meat and potatoes of all this is what actually goes into a social media policy. And then we'll talk a little bit about social media guidelines for participants. In other words, what kind of policy is required for patrons or users that are posting to a library's social media. Two different things. We're going to be spending most of our time on social media for staff, because the reason for that might be sort of self-evident for many of you, which is that most of the social media platforms these days have a whole bunch of terms of service that cover a lot of different scenarios. So we'll talk about what that might mean for a library. So one disclaimer, though, that I have to give before we dive too deep into any of this is this acronym. And if you've never seen this acronym before, it is an internet acronym, which is well known in some realms. And IANAL stands for I am not a lawyer, which you probably already knew if you knew who I was, or have read my bio, or just had any inkling of the general nature of library speakers. So I am not a lawyer. And I think that's really important to put out here right now, because sometimes when I do this, you just learned a new acronym, Shauna. Sometimes when I've done this in the past, people have asked me very specific legal questions, and clearly, and I want to be clear about this, I am not qualified to answer those. You do need to bring those to your library's legal counsel. I'm going to be talking about some very broad legal concepts that apply to social media policies. But when you start asking about very specific scenarios, maybe that have happened at your library or could happen at your library, I am not a lawyer. Very important acronym. That's not to say that I wouldn't try, but honestly, the definitive answer is always going to be consult your library's legal counsel. You've probably heard that before. That's like a mantra for a lot of administrators. And I am not your library's legal counsel. And even if I were a lawyer, I'd be one in Ohio. So it wouldn't necessarily be the best fit for folks in Wisconsin. So moving onwards, again, to stuff that we care about, right? You don't care that I'm not a lawyer. So this quote has been around actually for a while. I think Aaliyah Wright's book is at least 10 years old. And I've kept this quote because it points out something very important. Sometimes I will talk to libraries and they'll say, well, you know, we don't have, let's say we don't have a presence on TikTok, or we don't have a presence on Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is. And they say, well, you know, do we need to even worry about a policy? You know, maybe we only have one platform. Maybe they're not even using social media at all. Do we need a policy? The answer to that is still going to be yes, because what Wright points out here is this: even if their company has no social media presence, their employees may be creating one by virtue of their actions online. Plain English, somebody works in your library doesn't have a Twitter account, they go onto Twitter and they start complaining about your library. Your library now has a presence on Twitter just by the mere fact that it was mentioned. And this is why you need to have a policy. But let's say that same person doesn't hate the library, actually really likes their job and says, hey, I love my job at XYZ library. We just did this cool program today. Do you need a social media policy? Yes, you do. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as we get further in. So actually, Sean and I were talking about writing policies in general just before you all came in. Libraries tend to have a lot of different policies. They have patron conduct policies and collection policies, and of course all these leave policies, vacation policies, all sorts of things that may apply only specifically to employees. You do need to have a social media policy. Daniel Hanman is a lawyer at the employment law firm Hirschfield Kramer, and he told Bloomberg Law a while ago that social media policies are now just as necessary for employers as all of these others: discrimination, leave, vacation. You need to have these. And he actually said this over a decade ago. And so I was just saying to Shauna, and maybe some of you heard this little bit of the conversation when you came in, I don't get asked as much about this presentation as I did back when Hanman probably originally made that statement, simply because a lot of places already have accepted this as something that needs to be done. Does that mean that I'm going to crucify you if you do not, or make fun of you? No, because that's why I do this, is so libraries understand that this is a necessary thing. And many lawyers have told us, not just Hanman, that, hey, this is something that you should have. But why? Why do we need this? Well, this question is a little more obvious than it probably was in the past, because in the past, and you know, probably most of you are old enough to remember when social media was kind of new, policies weren't really a thing, because everybody was just like, ooh, MySpace, remember MySpace, you know, then Facebook, and then, you know, we've got everything else that's come along since, and they were sharing and liking and tweeting and posting. And we started to see this blurring of the line between what our personal lives are and what our professional lives are. And we've seen that happen certainly over time, and that hasn't really changed. But what it has meant, especially for people who are in HR, you can, I don't know if we have any HR professionals here today, but I'm pretty sure if you ask one, they're just going to shake their heads and said, yeah, we've had people apply for jobs, we look at their social media, and we immediately know they're not going to get an interview. Maybe people today are better about not posting things they shouldn't on social media, but certainly that's been an ongoing thing. So as those personal lives and the work lives of people, you know, people outside the library, inside the library, everyone, they've gotten blurrier all the time. So at some point, an employee's social media activity is probably going to relate to something that's happened at work. So all that kind of begs this question, right? Can employees say what they want to? Do they have free speech rights, for example, to publicly criticize their bosses or their workplaces, especially now, you know, when in the social media age? Can I, for example, go on to Twitter or Mastodon even, or anything that's out there now? You know, can I make a TikTok video? Absolutely. Whatever it is, and just say, you know what, I don't like my job and here's why. because all of these social media things have kind of replaced the traditional stand around the water cooler and kvetch kind of thing. That's been going on for a while. But the answer to this question, can employees say what they want, is really, it's fuzzy and it's nuanced like you'd expect. You know, the famous lawyer's answer is it depends, and this isn't any different. So let's talk about why that is. So generally speaking, employees don't get broad First Amendment rights to say whatever they want without risk. So what that means is, you've probably heard this 100 times, you can say whatever you like, but that doesn't mean you're free from the consequences of whatever you just said. But employees do have protections under the National Labor Relations Act. What's very interesting about this act, if you're not someone who's into legislation, myself included, I could never be a lawyer, but what's interesting to me about this is look at the date on this. It actually was enacted in 1935. And what it says is that employees have the right to engage in what's called concerted activity for collective bargaining, or what they call other mutual aid. And this, although it happened in 1935, applies to all employees, not just those who might be in a union. Before the rise of social media, though, the law rarely was used in non-union workplaces. Workers still complained about their jobs, but they were doing it in such a visible way. And so in 1935, Congress enacted the NLRA to protect the rights of employees and encourage collective bargaining, and so that dangerous workplace policies were harder to hide. Over the last few years, the National Labor Relations Board has released a series of memos on the lawfulness of corporate social media policies. And because, especially when social media policies were just kind of coming into being as a thing, that's very specific, right? But they were starting to get big, and more bigger companies were realizing that it was something they needed to have because their employees were going out there and saying all kinds of things. They found that one of the most common offenses with these corporations was that they were trying to restrict employees from discussing quote unquote confidential information like wages and working conditions on social media. And they're allowed to do that because this is what this act says, is that is protected speech. So if a work rule has the potential to reasonably chill an employee's right to organize or to bargain collectively, it's unlawful. Employees do have the right to complain publicly if they think their employer's labor practices aren't fair. So if I complain on LinkedIn that someone else is making more than me, and hey, that's not fair, that's a protected activity. If you fire me, though, for disclosing confidential salary information, you're going to lose in court. It's as simple as that. And if your social media policy prohibits it, then you're opening yourself up to a lawsuit, and probably under this particular act. So there's just a little bit of legal stuff. That's about as much as I'm going to do from the legal standpoint, since remember, IANAL, I am not a lawyer. So what that really means, though, for those of us who aren't legal specialists, is that your social media policy can't limit free speech, and you don't have to even reference the National Labor Relations Act to violate it. If your social media policy uses language that, say, restricts employees from using social media to damage or defame or ruin the reputation of your library, that could potentially be seen by the National Labor Relations Board as restricting protected labor rights, because it could, as they say, have a chilling effect on what is seen as free speech. The other hand, though, and this is part of the reason why that you get the lawyer's typical "it depends" answer when you start asking that question, can employees say what they want? If those restrictions in the social media policy are subordinated to something else that, for example, sexual misconduct, sexual harassment. If you say, hey, at our library, employees can't sexually harass one another, probably you have this in an employee policy of some sort, and that is going to also cover social media. So someone can't start sexually harassing someone through social media, not necessarily in the library. That's what it means by subordinate. So if you already have that policy and it's that kind of policy, again, here's where you need your lawyer. You know, if someone's discriminating racially or making racial or ethnic slurs or anything like that, that's probably almost certainly prohibited in language somewhere in your existing policies. Someone can't do that on social media either. So that is not necessarily protected free speech for employees, at least not aimed at one another. Again, consult your lawyer, but that's what it is, broadly speaking. So remember, the National Labor Relations Act is all about this. Is the speech concerted activity? So, and the problem with social media is, how do you decide if it's quote unquote concerted activity? Because generally that's been interpreted to mean that it has to involve more than one employee. So if someone at your library posts something on Facebook and no one comments, it's probably not going to be considered concerted. And court decisions have already made it clear the language, if it's threatening in any way, by the way, is also not acceptable. And honestly, that comes under the terms of service for virtually every social media platform anyway. But if someone posts something on Facebook or any place and says, hey, you know what? I hate my job. Is that protected? Yes. Now you can say, okay, let's you get someone else who comments on that, maybe who is anonymous, or someone else who says, yeah, you know, I hate it too. It gets very fuzzy. Is it concerted at that point? That's where you need a lawyer. That's why I'm very clear about what I can and can't do here. And this is really what it often boils down to, is whether or not it's going to be protected under the National Labor Relations Act. More reasons, honestly, to have a policy and to have it reviewed by a lawyer. So if you think this kind of thing doesn't happen in libraries, go talk to your HR professional. That's the first thing I'll tell you, is because I assure you they have stories. They may not talk about them. They may not be able to tell you specifics, but if you ask them, are there social problems with social media and employees in our library? The answer is probably going to be yes. I can tell you one story. This one I think was actually in USA Today almost 10 years ago. And it brought to light kind of this whole idea that, yes, this stuff does happen in libraries. And of course, there's been more stories since then, but I use this one just to show people this is not really a new problem. So this is, I'm not going to use names here, but a library aide was fired after she got into a disagreement with the library about status updates she wrote on her personal, that's important here, her personal Facebook page. And she was fired for quote unquote inappropriate behavior and refusal to agree to performance expectations. And the aide said that she voiced her opinion at a staff meeting that pay for library aides needed to be increased. And she was told later that her tone was quote unquote disrespectful. The aide said she was just being her typical self, outspoken, but she wasn't being angry. But this aide frequently vented about the library management on her Facebook page, and occasionally posted humorous sayings, sometimes using her supervisor's first name in the post, and sometimes obscenity. And her Facebook settings, this kind of blows my mind. Even back then, it blew my mind. Her Facebook settings were public. Even 10 years ago, that was like a thing people shouldn't have done, and mostly didn't, but she did. And so she was called into a meeting with the library administrators, no big surprise there. They handed out her printouts of her Facebook posts from the past several months, and she was suspended. She was later terminated because she refused to sign a performance expectation letter. And the aide said that she felt that library managers were that them monitoring her personal Facebook page intruded on her privacy. Nowadays, perhaps that's more clear cut. I'm going to guess that everybody here is probably shaking their heads and groaning, because of course, if your Facebook page is set to public, or your particular post is set to public, that's exactly what it means. And HR managers look at that stuff, managers look at that stuff. It's public. You don't know even where that's going to pop up, even if people aren't actively looking for it. So this expectation of privacy is problematic at the very least, especially when your stuff is set to public. So let's go back to why with the policy thing again. So this distinction between personal and professional has pretty much faded. And I think that story about the aide and being fired from her library because she was posting what are probably inappropriate things about the library in a public forum, everybody has an account in something these days. There's very few people who have no social media at all. Personally, I wish I could get off of all social media, but that's not practical for most of us. So a social media policy is a useful way to set some ground rules for employees in regard to what they can do online when it comes to the library. And it's also a reminder, honestly, that the content they post isn't private and may ultimately reflect on the library. You can't stop them from saying what they want to say. Remember, you have a right to free speech, but you are not free from the consequences of that free speech. And that is very much what a social media policy can do, because it sets an expectation for what they can and can't do. So employees have a lower expectation of privacy online if employers notify them that their activity could potentially be monitored. And without that kind of a warning, which this library, that the library aid story was from, they didn't have one. Employers are in a weaker position in a lawsuit that could result from a firing based on what an employee does. So the library that fired that aide who was posting, not so nice things on Facebook, they didn't have a whole lot of leg to stand on from a legal perspective because they had no policy there. And again, it just sets an expectation between the employer and the employee. It's like, hey, we're aware that you as the employee can post stuff on social media, but you need to be careful about what that is. And here's why. So I mentioned HR folks. I don't know if we have any here today, but if we do, would you please just say hi in the chat? I'm always interested to talk to HR folks because they have some of the best stories. But when it comes to writing any policy that applies to staff, these are the folks you need to have involved. You should never be writing basically a staff policy without HR being involved. So you have to recognize that they should be there. And because if you have employees out there wherever on social media and they're slamming your workplace, you better believe you're going to need HR to be involved in this. So they should have a hand in writing the policy, whatever that policy is. And there's also a magnifying effect, and probably many of you have felt this when you've already dealt with other maybe troubling things in social media. When a complaint about somebody's workplace is made on social media, it can fuel another employee or just other people from starting to fire off their own complaints, right? That it's kind of like the schoolyard, there's a fight and then everybody gathers around, or, it's like the water cooler even, you're standing around there and someone says, oh, I hate this part of my job. And someone says, oh, I hate that too. That magnifying effect happens online, of course, and probably many of us already have experience with this. And once those complaints kind of balloon, stopping those kinds of things is difficult, if not outright impossible. Another problem for organizations, including libraries, is that social media makes false information difficult to dispel. I can't imagine that anyone here today is not grappling with the whole issue of misinformation and disinformation, and social media has exacerbated that exponentially. If something's heard or read or seen enough times, people who see those things might start believing them. You know, you say something often enough, some people start to believe it, for better, for worse. So this makes it very difficult sometimes, and we want to prevent this from happening in the first place. Again, another benefit to having a policy. Now, I've been kind of coming at this so far from the perspective of, oh, make sure your staff know what they can't do. But also the perspective of, well, you need a policy. I want to show you something that's on the opposite side of this coin. I've put the URL here to the whole post. There is some argument for not having a social media policy. I think that we would all like to believe that our staff can be trusted. But the reality is, honestly, if you have policies for your staff, you already know you have to set expectations, and social media policy is just another one of those expectations. Hopefully you never have to use it, right? That's the hope behind most policies, is that you write it, you protect yourself, and then you hope it never comes to bear. But there are some other considerations here that you may want to take into consideration. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the viewpoint from which a social media policy probably should be written. And I just want to have this here as something you'll have at the back of your mind, because, and again, I'll talk more about this in a bit. How you write a social media policy might be very different from other policies that you might write. But I think the one thing that we can probably all agree on is that the social media honeymoon has been over for a long time. It is not new. It is not novel. It doesn't matter what the newest, shiniest social media platform kid on the block is. The concept of social media is a standard now. This isn't new. So having a policy to cover it, again, remember, even if you're not on a platform, your employees could be, and they could be there saying things about you, good or bad. The honeymoon's over. So more and more now, we're seeing that social media is an integral part of how we communicate with virtually everyone. So we need to have a policy that covers that. Okay, so now you're like, Laura, I get it. We need a policy. Moving on, right, Laura? Okay, yes, let's talk now about what actually goes into a social media policy, because that's probably what you really came for today. Maybe you were already convinced, hey, I know, we got to have a policy. Good, okay, that battle's won. So let's assume you have gotten the buy-in and it's time to write a policy. Let's talk about the first thing, which are the big three rules that you need to have at the front of your mind when you go into this process. The first one is you've got to be specific. If you've ever written a policy for staff, you probably already know this, but there it is. Because otherwise information can be misunderstood. It makes it harder to implement. You know, yes, social networks change all the time. You know, you're not going to write something so specific, for example, that let's say it only covers, you know, back in the day, MySpace. Well, you probably don't have to worry about MySpace anymore. Don't be specific to platforms, but be specific about what can and cannot be done. And you may need to update that policy. Well, you know, I would say at least annually, you should be reviewing it. Some do it more often. Some look at it every 3 months. Some look at it twice a year. Just make a plan, though, to do it at least every 12 months. You also, and this is what I was referring to earlier when I said how you write a social media policy may be different from any other policy that you write, is you actually write it in a friendly tone, which is almost antithetical to most other policies most of us have been involved with. They're meant to be read by real people. So you need to write for real people. There's no reason for it to feel unfriendly and verbose. You have to be clear and succinct with an easy to understand and even approachable tone. And I'll show you an example of an international corporation that has an amazing social media policy. It does not have to be tremendously long, but keep it short, but keep it friendly. And your employees will thank you, and they're more likely to read it and understand it. Lastly, and you heard me say this before, you need to run it by a lawyer. You can write it, hopefully with the help of your HR person or people. But in the end, just like any other policy your library probably creates, you're going to need to run it by your library's legal counsel to make sure that it's not doing anything that it should, or if it should maybe include things that the lawyer feels should be in there based on his or her experiences writing these or seeing what other kinds of organizations are including. So when you start out a policy, you want to talk first about what the purpose of social media is for your library. It needs to address what's in it for the staff. What should they take away after reading your policy? One of the common themes that I see looking at introduction to social media policies is the idea that the policy should focus on the things that employees can do rather than what they can't do. And for those of us who have experience writing policies, this is, again, not something we're used to. But that's the spirit of social media, right? It's all about leveraging the positive. Now, of course, you could argue on the other hand of that, that a lot of social media isn't positive, but often the people who do social media for a library, they go into it with a positive outlook, despite the fact that honestly, social media work is pretty grubby. It's hard, but all of that needs to be evident in the policy. So the old way of doing things was to create this unnecessarily restrictive model that prevented people from really kind of getting involved with social media. And we'll talk about more in a minute about who gets involved on behalf of the library. That's something else that social media needs, or policy needs to do. But let's say you have employees on social media. Well, of course you do, right? You know this. Here's something that you can put in your policy is they need to be honest about who they are. If they're talking about the library at all, good or bad, they need to be honest that they work for the library. And they should use a disclaimer, whether it's a personal blog or any kind of social media site. You should say something like, opinions are yours alone, not that of the library or that of their employer. If you look at my Twitter bio, it says opinions are my own, but you already knew that. That's my disclaimer. So it's there officially, and I'm a state of Ohio employee. I am required to have something like that. But honestly, I probably would anyway, just because I'm aware of what's involved in most policies. Clearly, state of Ohio has pretty clear policies about social media. Now, I mentioned that I'd seen a very, very good social media policy. And as much as I love this, I don't think it's practical for probably libraries. But I want to show you just, we're used to pages and pages of policies or multi-page policies. And this is the opposite of that. Zappos has been known for some time. When they came out with this, there was a lot of huzzas and media attention, because this is pretty much their social media statement. Now, it might have evolved since then, but when they originally came out with it, this was it, word for word. Basically, their social media policy is to be yourself and don't be stupid. That's it. They can talk to their staff about what might not fit into that mold, but that's their policy. And again, maybe not practical for us, but it shows that they do trust their employees. And it's also, when you talk about readable and you talk about friendly, heck, it doesn't get better than this, right? Again, not something probably most of us can do, if any of us, but I like it as an example of even a large international corporation can do this. You also need to let staff know that they are responsible for what they post, right? So I said it already a couple times. You're free to say what you want, but that doesn't mean you're free from the repercussions of what you just said. So, because people tend to interpret having the right to express themselves as meaning there isn't necessarily a consequence for that when they say stupid things. And so, because what's going to happen if they say something about the library that can reflect back on the library, back on their employer. So they have to take responsibility for that. That's part of where that disclaimer comes in that says, hey, you know, your opinions are your opinions. They don't belong to the library, even though I might be tweeting or posting about the library. I don't know if you've ever heard the term DOOST. I had not heard that until I started looking into how to write a policy a long time ago. I'll put it into the chat. It's DOOCED. And it's a term that from the internet that means someone lost their job because of things that they said online. So nobody wants this to happen to them, right? Nobody wants to be deuced. But people do have to be responsible for your stuff. So you need to tell them that in the policy. They need to exercise sound judgment. They need to use common sense. Because employees can be held responsible if whatever they've done online negatively impacts the image of the library. Another thing that I've seen in some social media policies is basically a direction to take responsibility when you're wrong. Meaning, if let's say I post something about the library and it's not correct, whether it's good or bad, meaning that I go back and edit the post or say something along the line of, hey, my last post / tweet / TikTok, whatever, was wrong. And I found this out and here's the right version of it, or et cetera, et cetera. So be honest, encourage your employees, tell them you need to be honest about it, and you need to admit that publicly if you've said something that's not correct. Here's another example. This is from Intel, and this is just one clause. So I don't want you to think this is their whole policy. It's not. Clearly, they're not Zappos. They have a lot more to say on their policy than Zappos. But the part here that I emphasize, this was my emphasis, not theirs, always pause and think before posting. I actually really liked this because it's a good intro to, hey, you need to take responsibility and you need to fess up if you've done something or said something that you shouldn't. This is just a great example of that kind of a thing in a policy. You know, because sometimes we've all done it. We have posted things online or said things that maybe we later realize were not such awesome things to have posted. They actually cover that explicitly at Intel. Which leads to, of course, to be accurate. Employees, when they post things about the library and as library employees, need to be accurate. One thing that sometimes you'll see in a policy is that you are responsible for checking the accuracy of the information you post online. You know, you need to be diligent about your research. Make sure that what you're posting is factually correct. And, you know, we're library people, provide supporting sources for whatever that is whenever it's possible, because that's what we do. We're information professionals. Also be clear about separating your opinions from the fact. Your opinions do not necessarily, and in fact, rarely constitute fact. Make sure that your audience can see the difference between the two. And remember Zappos and their policy, right? Be real, use your best judgment. So you can say things like, you know, don't say things that can be interpreted as slurs or inflammatory. You know, the internet is full of varied opinions. It's okay for people to share theirs, but you never want someone to be branded as a racist or someone who starts flame wars or says, you know, very inappropriate things. So your employees have to understand that libraries aren't necessarily corporations, but we still, when I use that collective we, still do monitor social media sometimes. Now, does the HR person or the director sit around and look at everybody's social media accounts all day? Of course not. Ain't nobody got time for that. But it doesn't mean that there's not a possibility that that could happen, and employees need to be aware it is a potential thing that can happen. And if they go to another job, certainly some HR person's probably going to be looking, if nothing else. So they need to use their best judgment for whatever they're posting. So good judgment is really important, regardless of whether their online comments relate directly to their job or not, right? We don't want them coming off as saying things are completely inappropriate. You don't want to be getting a call from a reporter, hey, this employer just used a whole bunch of ethnic or racial or gender identity slurs. That's not a call any administrator wants. So I talked about this early on, right? That there's this blurring between what we consider to be our personal lives and what we consider to be our professional lives. And in the middle, we have social media. So this principle, be conscious when you're mixing those two, basically recognizes that these two personas often intersect. I know that especially back in the earlier days of social media, I knew a lot of library folks who had separate personal accounts on each platform and separate professional accounts. I don't know if anybody does that anymore. Maybe they do, and I just don't know. It doesn't seem to be such a common thing. Most people have continued to blur the lines. I always did. One account, one platform. That's just the way I am. I can't track more than that, to be honest. But you know, what you see of me on social media, that's me. That's what you get. There's not a separation of personalities. But telling staff to be conscious when they're mixing those two lives reminds them that everything that they post online, even when their stuff is private or protected, can ultimately be seen by anyone at any time. We all know, right? There's no privacy really on the internet, and the internet is forever. If someone takes a screenshot of something that you'd marked as private or only available to a few, once they've got that screenshot, it's game over. Anybody can see that. Someone can forward it. So again, something else you want to point out, part of that good judgment thing too. Copyright. Oh, and Jill says, I tried to have a separate Facebook work account and Facebook disabled it. Yes, this has gotten a lot more common. Facebook actually was on the early edge of not allowing multiple accounts. I know this happened to a good number of people. Shauna says, yes, the same. Yeah, Facebook has been probably, I don't know if the word better about that than others, but they locked that down quite a while ago. I think it's, you know, it's much easier, I think, to have separate Twitter accounts, for example. And you're right, probably, Jill and Shauna, you know, it is frustrating, but it's probably one of the reasons that having duplicate accounts on the same platform has lessened to such a degree, is because it's actually impossible in places like Facebook. Copyright, this should be a no-brainer for library people, but just in case, when you're posting something, always give people appropriate credit for their work and make sure you have the right to use something before you publish. You know, is this a good time for your staff to learn the basics of fair use and basic copyright? Yeah, probably. Does that mean you can't post memes? That's a messy situation. And honestly, I don't know of any court case where somebody came after an organization because they posted a meme that was all over the internet. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but at the very least, because we're library people, we do have to respect copyright. So we can't put, you know, full scans of some things out there. There is fair use, yes. And that's a whole different session that we could do. But cite sources, whenever you can, cite sources. You can't post confidential stuff. And you might think, oh, it's a library. There's no confidential stuff. There absolutely is. Libraries are very big into confidentiality and into privacy. And why? Because we protect patron privacy all the time. Little story here, back from the early 2000s, I was working in an IT department in a library, and we discovered that one of the reference staff had been writing a blog, and this was, you know, there weren't that many blogs in those days. He was writing a blog about stories, the things that happened in the library, which isn't horrible. The problem was that he was naming these patrons. These patrons' names were in these stories on his blog. That's almost inconceivable, I think, these days. It's shocking. back then it wasn't. And he just got a slap on the wrist. Even then, this is 20 years ago. I'm old, folks. 20 years ago, this guy got a slap on the wrist. He should have been kicked out the door without any ceremony. And today he probably would be. But back then, again, no social media policy. Blogs were brand new. We hadn't quite gotten to that point yet. But we do protect confidentiality. And I think that patron privacy is something that libraries go at great length to protect. So yes, there is protected stuff, and you need to say in your policy that they cannot violate patron privacy. They also need to respect their colleagues. You can't post stuff about your colleagues. If that staff person who had the blog, was posting stuff about other workers, like how much he hated the IT department, which he did, which is another story all by itself, which I will not tell here. But, if he'd been posting stuff about us and included our names, it would have been just as bad. You really can't be doing this. You have to consider the privacy of your coworkers and avoid posting photos or videos or conversations. One thing I think that's been become more widely known is how important it is to not take photos of people without their consent. You don't know what their family or personal situation is like. Maybe they're trying to stay off the grid because they've got, a very nasty ex or something, or they're in a custody battle with their former partner. You don't know what's going on. Make sure that you always have their permission, and you should avoid posting anything about them that could be a problem. You also don't want people who take great joy in starting fights on the internet. And I know some of these people, but you do need to be aware that this is not okay. You should tell them outright, avoid online fights. If you have a difference of opinion with someone, or you want to post about something that's controversial, they have to do it professionally. You can voice your opinion. Remember, there's free speech, but don't use social media for personal attacks or, inflammatory arguments. And remember, what they post isn't really private. There's no real private anything on the internet anymore. Here's a little part of IBM's social media policy. Don't pick fights, be the first to correct your own mistakes, and don't alter previous posts without indicating that you have done so. So there's that piece in the middle there, at the beginning, don't pick fights. And I thought this is pretty clear here. Don't do it. They're very clear about it. Now, one of the things that often comes up and definitely needs to be in a social media policy is who's in charge, because sometimes we'll see something on social media and we may not be the person who generally manages social media, or maybe it's kind of a fuzzy area where nobody's specifically assigned to it. And like, they're asking for a book recommendation, or they're complaining because, they couldn't use the self-checkout or whatever it is. Who answers that? That's something that needs to be in your policy. You need to say, hey, you can't speak on behalf of the library unless that's your job. Now, if you have 2 employees and it's the job of both of you, say that. All staff are enabled to answer blah, 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 whatever that is. But whatever it is, it should be answered by or responded to by the people that are designated to do that, so that you don't have people, even if they're well-intentioned, well-meaning, you don't want them charging in and starting to answer things, because often people who manage social media have kind of their own set of policies talking about what kind of voice they use when they respond to people on social media. You don't want just anybody doing this, especially when it's negative. You need to let the folks in charge of this do that, and that needs to be part of your policy. It's hard to talk about this piece, I think, a little bit, because I've said you need to make it friendly and readable, but you've heard me say it at least 3 times now. You can say what you want, but it doesn't mean you're free from the consequences of whatever you just said. There are consequences, and you need to be clear about what those consequences are. And I'm not talking about lawsuits here. I'm talking about your social media policy. If someone does something that is against your policy, and your policy is not, saying things, hey, you can't be on social media, or ridiculous things, social media does not occur in a vacuum. So a post that was originally meant for just your friends on Facebook may not stay that way for long. So you have to say something along the lines of, employees can be held responsible for the things that they publish online, even if they're at home on their own time and they think only certain people are going to see whatever it is. And you have to define what those consequences are. Chances are you probably already have something to some extent talking about discipline for employees. You're going to use the same thing here, just making people aware that they are, social media counts. You know, those disciplinary steps that HR will talk to you probably at great length about also apply to social media. And speaking of stuff that already exists, this is where social media's policies tend to tie into the employee manual. So you don't want to neglect the manual. You want to make sure, though, the people who are posting something of value. What do they have to offer the community? Not just posting stuff because, well, we got to post something. And that's almost a whole nother session. But it means that when you're writing your policy, you don't want people to just be posting willy-nilly on behalf of the library, even especially when they're not supposed to be posting on behalf of the library. These are from Columbus Metropolitan Library here in Ohio. They have a fairly extensive social media policy, but these are two little clauses that I pulled out because remember that story I told you about the reference staff person who was blogging about patrons? They explicitly have that in their policy. But the other piece here that I haven't mentioned is library logos and trademarks may not be used without written consent. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this, and probably you all have too, where people just do whatever they want with a library's logo and post it here, there, and everywhere and make changes to it. And if they were in a for-profit business, they also would be out the door without any ceremony. Logos and trademarks need to be protected. They are protected, and often for good reason. You don't want people to just use them everywhere. They're used in certain ways in specific circumstances. So this is something else I encourage libraries, just like Columbus Metro, to spell out in their policy. The thing is, once you have a policy, you need to train people on that policy. What good is it if it sits in a binder, right? Don't just send it an email. You've got to train people on this. All right, enough about writing one for staff, because you're probably like, that's enough, Laura. I know I would be. Let's talk a little bit about social media policies for patrons. This is, again, something that we don't spend as much time on, mostly because, especially these days, most, if not all, of the social media platforms have their own terms of service. And many of you may already be familiar with this. And reporting people for violating those terms of service. So I think in some ways, libraries don't have to take as much responsibility for creating a policy that they might have had to in the past, just because there's so much groundwork that's already been done for us, I guess. But you'd still probably want to have something. And if you do have something, and they can be very basic. I'm going to give you a URL in just a minute to a fairly simple library policy that's used for patrons online. But once you have that, you need to post it, even if you're not posting it to social media directly, because you can't generally post something like that directly to Twitter. To post links to it, you can put it in your bio or in your profile, the link for it. Here's a really good sample. This is actually from Angela Hirsch of Super Library Marketing. If you're not familiar, she has a great YouTube channel with some great stuff for beginner, intermediate, expert marketers in libraries. But she has a sample public policy here. So again, this is geared for patrons, not for staff. So I encourage you to use that as a template. One thing you might see sometimes, particularly, I can tell you, this is something that's more common in like police departments or law enforcement agencies. They have what they call a takedown policy. I won't go into great amounts of detail here because I know we're short on time, but the idea is the circumstances under which something is taken down. One thing I will tell you that I think you need to follow, even if you don't have the same kind of policy, is that when they talk about deleting comments or banning or anything like that, in a takedown policy, usually they will tell you, don't delete anything. Take screenshots, save it. Always keep the evidence, so that if you do ban someone or block someone or delete a comment, you've got that. So you can, if somebody comes back at you later and says, hey, you shouldn't have done that, you can show them exactly what was posted. If you want another sample here, for a public policy, this is from the National Archives. The URL is here on the slide if you want to screenshot it or grab it from the recording later. They have quite an extensive policy here, but it also talks about, who the media should talk to. They actually don't want the media or reporters trying to contact them through social media, not really their thing. So the point of a social media for employees is to empower your staff and yourself, because you're planning ahead, not just to be like, okay, don't do bad things, and if you do bad things, you're going to timeout. You want people to have some ability to go out and say good things, for sure, about the library. The point of a takedown or a participant or patron guideline policy is to keep your community running smoothly and protect your library. You don't want people thinking they have the freedom to say whatever. And honestly, like I said, most people on social media kind of know that these days because of those terms of service. So again, you might want to screenshot this or grab it later, but there's some really great resources here, most of which actually are specific for libraries, which I know is something that people are always interested in. So I wanted to share that with you. Grab your screenshot, get it later. And I know we have just a few minutes left. There's so much information here, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have at this point, or things that I skipped over earlier. If you need clarification, I'll take whatever it is. I know I just threw a lot of information at you. And I'm always curious too, while you're thinking about that, have any of you run into a situation where you didn't have a social media policy and something came up and you wish that you did?
I can say
Anyone?
that in the past, I had wished that we had a social media policy when I was at a public library, because of just like negative comments, basically, on our
And those,
Facebook page, where it felt fine trying to, like, on the spot, respond, but it would have been nice to have more guidance. Like if it kept going.
were those from staff or patrons?
Oh, sorry, from patrons.
Yeah, it's almost harder to manage that in some ways because you don't have as much control. I actually do a whole session on handling negativity online. But there's a lot there, and it's frustrating to deal with, for sure. Well,
oh, there is one Q&A.
Oh, I just saw that pop up.
Yeah, tips for departments who feel they don't give equal time on social media posts when the social media accounts are managed by another internal department.
Oh, the good old territorial argument. This is always a fun one. And, I used to work in at least 2 multi-branch systems, so I get it. The problem is that there's only so many places to post and only meet so many times a day. I can tell you, just to preface this a little bit, when I was a children's librarian long ago, I kept hounding our PR person to send out, this was pre-social media, okay? Told you I'm old. I kept hounding our HR person or PR person to send postcards about every story time that I did, because I was trying so hard to get people to come in for story time. And she was blunt with me, and to this day, I'm glad that she was. She said, Laura, that's not practical, and you can't just bombard people all the time with stuff. Nobody, and I know you like your story time, but you're going to get lost in the shuffle. And that is what happens on social media as well. If you bombard people with stuff, it gets lost in the shuffle, especially because we're in competition with literally everybody. I can tell you that for systems that there's 2 things here that you can do, or at least be thinking about. If you're in a multi-branch system or a system where you're trying to promote things from multiple departments, one thing that I've seen several libraries do is that they have specific days where that department or that branch is featured. So everybody knows, for example, that on Wednesday, South Branch gets their stuff posted. That is sometimes something I think that's a really good compromise. And if you've got more branches or departments than there are days, you probably have to break it down a little differently. The other thing here that sometimes gets lost, I think, is that it's really important for social media to be handled by one department. So the thing that I'll hear sometimes is, well, okay, this department, usually PR, to be honest, is doing all the social media. Why can't we do social media? Social media should be handled in one place with one voice. Sometimes I'll especially hear this with branches, like, well, okay, Maine gets all the attention. What about us? Why can't we post? Why can't we have a separate account for our branch? I have never advocated for separate branches or separate departments. You do not want to be diluting the voice of your library. So as frustrating as that can be, it's better to come to some kind of compromise with the department that is in charge of posting stuff than trying to, because I've seen this before, is like, well, we're not getting what we want out of public relations, so we're going to do it on ourselves. That's another reason you need a policy, is so that people can't go do that, because that's very bad from a branding perspective. And Shauna says, I agree, having a calendar of some kind maybe, or being specific about days of the week or weeks in the month. Yeah, and most departments that are doing regular work in social media these days do have some kind of editorial calendar, and that's how that usually gets managed.
I like that. Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you so much for your questions, folks who were able to make it today. If something comes up afterward, please feel free to email me. Again, thank you, Laura, so much for all this great information.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I hope to talk to you all soon.
Great. Take care, everybody.